Laura Harrison had it all: a successful career as a marketing executive, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and a husband, Jeffrey, who adored her at first glance. Her life was the epitome of success, but beneath the surface, Laura felt a persistent restlessness and a yearning for something she couldn't quite name. He was the kind of man everyone admired. He was thoughtful, kind, and as steady as a rock. He was an architect with a keen eye for detail. He could spend hours lost in the precision of his blueprints. He loved Laura deeply and always took care to nurture their relationship. However, his predictability had become suffocating. Dinner conversations had become more formal, with polite inquiries about each other's days. The spark they once shared was now a distant memory. Enter Kevin. Laura met him at a networking event downtown. He was everything Jeffrey wasn't: charismatic, unpredictable, and engaging with an energy that filled the room. Kevin was dressed in a suit and had a confident smile. He was magnetic and drew Laura in like a moth to a flame. Their first conversation crackled with chemistry, and they felt an instant connection. It started innocently enough. They exchanged business cards and met for coffee to discuss potential collaborations. Before long, they were seeking each other out more and more, as weeks turned into months. Laura's attraction to Kevin deepened into something more dangerous. Their meetings became secretive, clandestine encounters in dimly lit bars and out-of-the-way restaurants where no one knew them. Laura's internal as the meetings went on. She felt more and more conflicted. She knew she was betraying Jeffrey, but the excitement of being with Kevin was hard to resist. She tried to justify her actions, telling herself that she deserved a little excitement and that she was entitled to happiness. But she also had a nagging voice in her head. She was reminded of the vows she had made and the man she was deceiving in the quiet moments when she was alone. Laura would sit by the window, staring out at the world. She was often lost in thought, reflecting on her marriage. She recalled the early days, filled with laughter and love. Jeffrey had been her rock, supporting her ambitions and celebrating her successes. But somewhere along the way, she had changed. Perhaps he had too, despite the guilt gnawing at her conscience. Laura continued to see Kevin. The more time she spent with him, the more she found herself slipping into the fantasy of a different life. It made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. It reignited a passion she thought she had lost forever. She loved the spontaneity of their relationship and the unpredictability that made each encounter feel like an adventure. One evening, as she lay in bed beside Jeffrey, her mind drifted to the life she was. She was leading a double life, filled with secrets and lies. She turned to look at Jeffrey. His face was peaceful in sleep. She felt remorse. He didn't deserve this. But the thought of ending things with Kevin filled her with dread. It felt like she were giving up a part of herself. Laura's the struggle intensified her emotions, making her feel like she was navigating a tumultuous sea. She knew she was at a crossroads, but the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. Part of her wanted to return to the safety and comfort of her marriage to rekindle the love she once shared with Jeffrey. But another part of her was drawn. Laura was irresistibly attracted to Kevin, the man who had awakened her deepest desires. She told herself, "I never planned for this to happen, but Kevin makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. I wish I could have both worlds, but I know that's impossible." Laura knew she had to make a choice, but as the moonlight streamed through the curtains, she realized that whatever decision she made, her life would never be the same again. Laura had never imagined she would find herself in such a predicament. Yet here she was, about to propose the unthinkable. She had spent many sleepless nights grappling with the idea and convincing herself that Jeffrey, ever the reasonable and compassionate man, would understand her desire for an open relationship. She had even turned her internal dialogue into a mantra. Jeffrey will understand. He always listens to reason. The thought had taken root, and with each repetition, it became more and more convincing. Laura's belief in the plan grew stronger. It was bold, perhaps foolish, but she felt she had no other choice. The double life she was leading was unsustainable, and the burden of secrecy was becoming too much to bear. She loved Jeffrey, but her connection with Kevin was undeniable and powerful. She convinced herself that if anyone could understand the complexity of love and desire, it would be Jeffrey. He was rational, empathetic, and he trusted her. Surely he would at least hear her out. On the day of the dinner, Laura found herself meticulously planning every detail. The menu was a careful selection of Jeffy's favorite dishes. She knew a nice meal would cheer him up, so she spent the afternoon in the kitchen, making sure the vegetables were chopped and sauces were simmering. She set the table with their best china, candles and flowers to make it feel warm and welcoming. As she moved around the house, her mind ran through all the different ways the evening could go. She felt a little anxious, but underneath it all, she felt determined. This was her chance to get her happiness back and build a life that would make her heart sing. When Kevin arrived, she greeted him with a kiss, which momentarily calmed her nerves. She could see the apprehension in his eyes, though he tried to hide it with a confident smile. Kevin had always been self-assured, but even he seemed unsure about the audacity of Laura's plan. "Trust me, Jeffrey will understand." Laura's voice was calm, but her hands were shaking a little, showing how worried she was. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "What if he doesn't take it well?" "He loves me, Kevin. That's why I believe he'll listen." As the clock ticked towards dinner time, Laura's anticipation mingled with fear. She paced the living room, rehearsing her speech in her mind, trying to find the perfect words to express the complexity of her emotions. She glanced at the door every few minutes, waiting. When she heard the sound of Jeffrey's car pulling into the driveway, Laura felt a rush of adrenaline. She took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and checked her reflection in the mirror. Her mind was filled with doubts and what-if scenarios, but she quickly pushed them aside. She had to see this through. Jeffrey came in, filling the room with the calm aura that Laura had always liked. He greeted her with a warm smile, not noticing the storm brewing beneath the surface. Kevin stood by the fireplace, trying to look casual even though there was tension in the air. In the air, Jeffrey's voice is slightly shaky, but growing stronger with each word. "I've invited Kevin to join us for dinner. There's something important we need to discuss." Jeffrey looked from Laura to Kevin, a little confused, crossing his features. "All right," he said slowly, clearly sensing the gravity. The three of them sat down at the table. The clinking of cutlery against plates filled the room with an awkward silence. Laura knew that this was the moment her life could take an unexpected turn. Jeffrey was unaware of the true purpose of the evening, and made polite conversation. Laura was trying to figure out who Kevin was and why he'd been invited to their home. The initial pleasantries were just that, but there was an undercurrent of tension that grew with each passing moment. Laura watched them from across the table, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the anticipation and fear as she sat next to Kevin. She could see that he was uneasy, glancing at Ted and seeking reassurance. Jeffrey, ever the gracious host, asked Kevin about his work and interests. He was curious, but there was an edge to his questions. Kevin answered Jeffrey's questions with practiced ease, his charisma on full display. However, Laura could see the tension in his shoulders as the conversation meandered through various topics. She felt the moment approaching, the moment. When she had to be completely open with him, Laura felt a rush of nervous energy. She had practiced what she was going to say, but now she was supposed to say it. She glanced at Kevin, who gave her a subtle nod as if to say, "Go for it." Finally, she gathered her courage and spoke. "Jeffrey, I've been thinking. There's a lot on my mind about us and our lives together. I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I need to share it with you." She paused, looking at him to see if he understood. Jeffrey put down his fork and focused on her. "I'm listening, Laura. What is it?" he asked, looking at her. Kevin and back to her. Taking a deep breath, Laura forged ahead, ready to unveil the truth and face whatever came next, hoping against hope that Jeffy's reason and love would guide them through the storm. "This is Kevin, Laura," she said, gesturing to her lover. Her words hung heavily in the air. "He's moving in with us. You have to share me with him. You can't say no or he'll be really upset." There was a moment of silence. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, punctuating the silence. Jeffy's face remained unreadable. His eyes were fixed on Laura, as if he were trying to decipher. It was like a complex puzzle. The tension in the room was palpable. It was as if it were a living thing, pressing down on them all. Laura's heart was racing. Her breath caught in her throat as she waited for Jeffrey to react. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, but reality was far more daunting than she had anticipated. Jeffrey didn't speak. He didn't shout or get angry or storm out of the room. He simply sat there, his eyes locked onto Laura's. His silence was more eloquent than any words he could have uttered. It was a silence that spoke of shock, disbelief, and betrayal. That was worse than any wound. Laura's pulse was racing. Kevin was clearly uncomfortable. He'd lost his confidence. He'd seemed so sure of himself earlier, but now he seemed unsure of himself. He looked to Laura for guidance, but she was as lost as he was in the echoing silence. Finally, Jeffrey spoke. His voice was low and measured, carrying a weight of emotion that belied his calm demeanor. "Laura," he began, his gaze never wavering, "I need you to explain what the hell you're asking." Laura swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her proposition. "I love you, Jeffrey," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I also love Kevin. I thought we could find a way to make it work." Jeffrey leaned back in his chair. Jeffrey's eyes closed briefly as he listened to Laura. When he opened them again, he looked upset. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice raw and vulnerable. There was a heavy, oppressive silence as Laura and Jeffrey stared at each other across the table. The gap between them seemed wider than ever. Laura's proposal was still there, a catalyst for change that could shatter everything they had built together. Laura felt her resolve falter, doubt creeping in like a shadow. Had she made it was a terrible mistake. She wanted more, and it led her down a path from which there was no return. She realized that whatever happened next, the balance of their lives had been irrevocably altered. There was no going back, only forward into the uncertain future that awaited them all. The silence that followed Laura's proposition was suffocating. There was a tangible weight that pressed down on everyone in the room. Jeffrey's eyes bore into hers. He was confused, hurt, and angry. He sat motionless as if rooted. Jeffrey stood up and slowly pushed his chair back. Laura's heart beat faster as she watched him leave the room without a word. The sound of his footsteps receded into the distance, leaving behind an echoing emptiness that filled the space between her and Kevin. "What are you doing?" Kevin whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Jeffrey had disappeared through the door, and Laura could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She was afraid, and she knew that she should have expected anger, perhaps even a heated argument. But not this silence, not this retreat into the unknown. Minutes stretched into eternity as Laura and Kevin sat in uneasy silence. The clock ticked away the seconds, and every second that passed without Jeffrey's return only heightened their sense of foreboding. Jeffrey reappeared in the doorway, rifle in hand. The sight of the weapon sent a shock through Laura. Her breath caught in her throat. Jeffrey's face was a mask of cold determination. His eyes were empty. Of the warmth and kindness she had come to rely on, Kevin's reaction was immediate and visceral. He shot to his feet, his chair toppling over with a crash. His face drained of color as he stared at Jeffrey in disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" Kevin blurted out, his voice high-pitched. "You think I'll just let this happen?" "You're in for a surprise, Jeffy." His voice was low and steady, like a quiet storm of fury and betrayal. He took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Laura. His words cut through the air with razor-sharp precision. "You've underestimated me, Laura." The room spun around her, the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't how she'd imagined things would unfold, not the outcome she'd envisioned. It was a stark reality check on her choices. A wave of consequences and regret crashed down on her, threatening to drown her. "Jeffrey, please," she began, her voice trembling as she tried to bridge the chasm that had opened up between them. "I didn't mean for it to come to this. I just thought you could walk all over me," Jeffrey interrupted, his grip tightening on the rifle, and his gaze never leaving hers. "You could take everything we've built and throw it away like it meant nothing." "Nothing," Kevin said, edging towards the door. His eyes were darting between Jeffrey and the path to freedom. His body was tense with the instinct to flee. "Let's just calm down, okay?" he said. His voice was shaky, trying to diffuse the situation. There was no need for this, but Jeffrey was beyond reasoning. His emotions were a turbulent sea of betrayal and heartbreak. "Don't, Laura," she pleaded, her voice breaking as she reached out toward him. Desperation clawed at her heart. "Please, let's just talk about this." Jeffrey's gaze flicked to Laura. There was a flicker of something hurt in his eyes, perhaps, before the steely resolve returned. "You want to talk?" he said, his voice a mixture of incredulity and bitterness. "I'm done talking," Kevin said, making a sudden dash for the door. His movements were a blur of panic. Jeffrey was faster, stepping to block his path with a rifle trained on him. The tension in the room was palpable. Kevin was desperate to escape at all costs. The chair he had knocked over lay forgotten on the floor, a testament to his frantic bid for freedom. Jeffrey was relentless in his pursuit, his footsteps echoing through the hallway. He was fueled by a potent mix of anger and betrayal. After Kevin, the front door slammed open, and Kevin stumbled into the night. His heart was pounding in his chest like a wild drumbeat, and his mind was racing. He was flooded with a jumbled mix of fear and disbelief at how quickly things had spiraled out of control. He had never imagined that Laura's plan could lead to such a volatile confrontation. Yet here he was, running for his life. The cool night air hit him like a shock, but there was no time to savor it. Behind him, Jeffy's determined footsteps grew closer. A stark reminder of the danger that had followed Kevin. The usually peaceful and quiet neighborhood now felt like an alien landscape. As Kevin ran down the street, his lungs burning with every ragged breath. Inside the house, Laura stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and horror. She had never intended for things to escalate to this level of violence. She had never dreamed that her husband could be pushed to such extremes. Yet as she listened to the sounds, as the chase echoed through the open doorway, she realized that she couldn't control the situation anymore. A sickening mix of guilt and fear churned in her stomach as she rushed to the door. Her heart ached with the realization of how deeply she had underestimated Jeffy's capacity for fury. The man she had known for years, the man who had always been a pillar of calm and reason, was now a stranger driven by rage and betrayal. "Please," Kevin gasped. Jeffrey was closing the distance between them with alarming speed as he glanced over his shoulder at Kevin, who was trying to make his voice carry through the night. "I didn't mean for it to come to this." "You made your choice when you walked through that door," Jeffrey replied. With him, his legs were burning with exertion as he pushed himself harder. Desperation was fueling his flight as he got off the street and into a nearby park, hoping to lose Jeffrey among the trees and shadows. The park was dark and unfamiliar. Its winding paths and dense foliage provided some semblance of cover as Kevin ducked behind a cluster of bushes, trying to quiet his ragged breathing. He pressed himself against the ground, his pulse hammering in his ears as he strained to listen. For any sign of Jeffrey's approach, minutes stretched into an excruciatingly long time as Kevin lay hidden. Each second was a reminder of how precarious his situation was. His mind was racing with possible escape routes, but each one seemed dangerous. The likelihood of evading Jeffrey was dwindling with every passing moment. Meanwhile, Laura stood at the edge of the driveway, her hands trembling as she stared into the darkness. She was hoping against hope that Jeffrey would come to his senses and give up the chase. Her heart was a twisted knot of regret and fear. Each beat reminded her of the decisions that had brought them to this point. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The stillness of the night amplified every sound. The distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves, the faint call of a night bird. Then finally, the sound she had been dreading, a sharp crack that shattered the silence and reverberated through the air like a final terrible punctuation. The sound jolted Laura out of her paralysis. Her heart was pounding as she stumbled forward, driven by a desperate need to understand what had just happened. The echoes of that single shot rang in her ears as she moved towards the park. Fear propelled her forward, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. The night's chaos had faded into a tense and haunting silence, leaving Jeffrey standing alone in the park. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the confrontation was over, leaving behind a hollow emptiness and an overwhelming sense of disbelief. His rifle hung loosely in his hands, the weight of it a tangible reminder of how things had spiraled out of control. The moon cast a pale glow over the park, its light filtering through the trees and illuminating Jeffrey's face. His expression was one of weary resignation, the lines of anger and determination slowly softening into something more profound. He knew there was no going back from the choices that had brought him to this point. The words were a stark acknowledgement of the irreversible path they had all taken. He couldn't shake the image of Kevin's fearful eyes from his mind, nor could he forget the look of betrayal on Laura's face when he had confronted them both. Jeffrey had always prided himself on being a rational and composed man, but the events of the night had shattered that self-image. Think about it. His actions had been driven by a primal fury, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed until it had erupted to the surface. Now, standing in the aftermath of that eruption, he was left to grapple with the reality of what he had done. Slowly he turned and began the walk back to his home, the rifle tucked under his arm. Each step echoed with the weight of his thoughts. He knew that the path ahead would be fraught with difficult conversations and painful realizations, but he was determined to face them. He was determined to understand how their once. Meanwhile, Laura was sitting on the front steps of their home, her face buried in her hands, trying to make sense of the night's events. The sound of that single gunshot was still ringing in her ears, a chilling reminder of the consequences of her choices. "What have I done?" she whispered. Laura's voice was trembling with emotion as she thought about the journey that had led her to this moment. She was reflecting on her marriage, the excitement of her affair with Kevin, and the belief that she could have it all without consequence. She had been blinded by her desire and unable to see the damage she was causing to the people she loved. She could see the damage she was doing to the people she loved as she sat there. She suddenly realized what she had lost. Kevin was gone. He was just a memory now. And Jeffrey, the man she had promised to love and cherish, was now a stranger. He was standing on the edge of a future that seemed uncertain. Laura was overwhelmed by the thought of what might have been done differently, and the conversations she should have had with Jeffrey before things had spiraled so far out of control. She was acutely aware of the lives that had been irrevocably altered by her choices, and the sound of footsteps drew her attention. Laura looked up to see Jeffrey approaching. He seemed tired and resigned. He stopped a few feet away, looking at her with a searching intensity that made her heart ache. "I didn't mean for it to end like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The sincerity of her regret was clear, and Jeffrey nodded slowly, as if in agreement. He didn't say anything, but his voice told a different story. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair as he looked up at the stars. It seemed like he was searching for answers in the vastness of the sky. "There's no going back from this." As the night wore on, it became clear to both of them that the future would be shaped by the choices they made now. Jeffrey and Laura stayed there on the steps, two people trying to make sense of what had happened, searching for a way forward in the soft morning light. The events of the previous night seemed it was like a distant nightmare, but the emotional scars were still raw and real. Laura woke up on the couch where she had finally fallen asleep. She was weighed down by the weight of her choices. She rubbed her eyes to shake off the fog of exhaustion, and realized that she had to face the reality of what lay ahead. Jeffrey sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee that was getting cold in front of him as he stared out the window. The world outside kept going, with birds singing in the trees and cars passing by, not noticing the chaos that had consumed their lives. His mind was a jumble of emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness. But underneath it all was a desire to find a way. Laura stood in the doorway, watching Jeffrey's profile as he lost himself in thought. She took a deep breath and steeled herself for the conversation they needed to have. This conversation would determine the course of their future. "Jeffrey," she said softly, stepping into the kitchen. Her voice was tentative, laced with he was vulnerable, like someone who had seen her world come crashing down. He turned to look at her, his eyes showing he was tired but listening. "We need to talk," Laura said, her heart pounding with fear at what he might say. She had spent the night thinking about her actions, how she had been selfish and impulsive, and how she had risked. She knew she owed him an apology for everything they had built together. But she also knew that words alone might not be enough. Jeffrey nodded and gestured for her to sit across from him. The space between them felt vast, filled with unspoken words and unresolved emotions, but it was a start. A fragile beginning to what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. "I was wrong, Jeffrey," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her confession. "I should have talked to you. I should have tried to fix what was wrong between us instead of looking elsewhere. I'm so sorry for everything." Her words hung in the air, an offering of remorse and regret, an acknowledgement of the pain. She had caused it. She held her breath, waiting for Jeffrey's response. Her heart ached with the hope that there was still a chance to salvage what remained of their relationship. Jeffrey met her gaze. His expression softened as he considered her apology. He could see the sincerity in her eyes and the remorse that reflected his own pain. "Laura, he said, his voice low and steady. "I felt like everything we had meant nothing to you, like I was nothing to you." They sat in silence for a moment. Jeffrey had spent the night thinking about his own actions. He realized that he too had a role to play, to bridge the gap that had grown between them, and to acknowledge that perhaps he had taken their relationship for granted. "We have to find a way forward, whatever that may be," Jeffrey finally spoke up, his voice carrying a quiet determination. He was unsure whether it meant rebuilding their marriage or parting ways, but he knew that they needed to confront their issues head-on. To be honest about their feelings and desires, Laura nodded, relieved that he was willing to try. "Jeffrey, I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." They realized they needed to make some changes and rebuild their communication if they wanted to move forward together. As the day went on, they started to feel more hopeful. Despite the challenges ahead, they knew they could work through them with patience and forgiveness. They were committed to doing what was best for both of them, whether that meant reconciliation or going their separate ways.